Hi, everyone, and welcome to Robust American Love. My name is Karen Karbiener, and I am president of the Walt Whitman Initiative. That's a 501c3 nonprofit organization with a mission of celebrating New York City's literary legacy. We serve as an organizing center for cultural activism and poetry-related events like the one you're just about to enjoy. Please follow us on Facebook and Instagram and tune into our YouTube channel. I think some of you are in there right now to explore more presentations in our Robust American Love speaker series. And if you like what we're doing, there are many ways to support our programs and initiatives. Please visit our website to find out how, or write to Walt at waltwhitmaninitiative.org. Back in August of 2020, we decided to start up this speaker series. Note the word speaker, it's not a lecture, to present timely public-facing conversations on Whitman's life, work, and legacy. You will hear conversations and enjoy presentations by teachers, poets like Jason, grad students, artists, printers, neighborhood activists. The whole idea is that these are not academic talks, but free, open, and informal discussions that we end by inviting you and your questions. So please, if you're in the YouTube channel right now as we're live, you can add those into our chat. And if you miss this and you're seeing it later, that's fine too. We've got a whole record of wonderful speakers that you can catch up with, again, at our YouTube channel. I have a couple of announcements too. We've got a lot going on here, Jason. I'm very happy to say. We finally figured out we're going to do the Song of Myself marathon online again this year. I know that's a little bit disappointing for people because it is a New York City tradition to get out there in Brooklyn, Brooklyn Bridge Park, and do that recitation with the Brooklyn Bridge and Manhattan in the background. We will be there in spirit, but we found last year when we did it online, it brought the world into the Song of Myself marathon. So we're really excited to offer that again out there. 18th annual Song of Myself marathon, which will be Sunday, June 6th, 4 to 7 p.m. We have not sent out the call for readers yet. For those of you familiar with the Song of Myself marathon, it is a free, open, glorious event. You can actually watch the recording of last year's event up on our YouTube channel. Absolutely fantastic. 52 speakers, including Jason, our guest today, who did recitations of the 52 different parts of Whitman's grand epic poem, and everybody brings their own style to it. Some people sing it, some people perform it, recited in different languages. It's really quite magnificent. We will soon announce the opening of those 52 spots. There's no obligation and no payment. That's just our kind of yearly gift to the city and now the world. So please do stay tuned. And if you're wondering how you can stay tuned besides watching this show, we are actually starting up our own newsletter. This is a huge step for the Walt Whitman Initiative, which is completely volunteer driven. But Dee Quee, who's one of our board members, has put us on the right track. And we've got an intern, Freddie Widmer, who's also working with her. And it looks like April 1st will be our first newsletter. So if you're wondering about how to get the newsletter, you can sign up at info@waltwhitmaninitiative.org. Please stay tuned for that very first, very exciting way of us keeping up with you and hearing from you. One of the events that we'll also be announcing in that newsletter is our very first Song of Myself marathon poster contest. Those of you that have done the Song of Myself marathon before know that we usually have some art that goes with the poetry, and it's usually just donated by lovely people that are our friends, like Brian Selznick, the illustrator, and last year Tristan Pullen, who is actually manning this ship tonight. Thank you very much, Tristan, a board member here at the Whitman Initiative, and he also did my background here, this beautiful virtual background. So, but this year we got an anonymous donor for this event. It's going to be $200, which is kind of nice. And the rules for the poster contest will be posted both at our website and in the newsletter. So another reason to sign up at info@waltwhitmaninitiative.org to get that Walt Whitman Initiative newsletter probably once a month in your inbox. If you go to our website, you're also going to see the announcement for our first fellowship. We're very excited about this. Susan Tain, who has been a very big supporter of our events and is a prominent Whitman collector, has donated enough for us to start up a yearly Whitman fellowship for younger academics, or I should say young academics in their early careers, and also graduate students. So please take a look. All that information is already up at our website. The application deadline for that is June 15th, 2021. And we are offering $1,500 for that fellowship, as well as mentorship within the Walt Whitman Initiative. So we hope you give that a good look. And we're very, very proud and thankful to Susan for setting us up with that. Next time we meet will be in April. And now I'm forgetting, I think it's April 13th, I want to say, that Stephen Killen and the poet Howard Nelson are going to be visiting with us. So those of you tuned in now, please mark your calendars. That's Tuesday, I think. Let me just take a quick look. Tuesday, April 13th. I'm right, at 6 o'clock. And this is called Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, a pinhole photography project. Stephen Killen is a Brooklyn-based photographer and just designer extraordinaire who was captivated by the poem Crossing Brooklyn Ferry when he was actually doing a commercial shoot of New York Harbor. And he wound up reading some of the poet Howard Nelson's work on Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, really getting into it, really digging it. And Stephen is also a pinhole photographer. And if you haven't seen what that is, you can look at the Walt Whitman Initiative website. We've got a couple of the images up there. And of course, Stephen is going to explain this next month as well. But you absolutely must join Stephen, Howard, and me next month as we talk about pinhole photography, New York City ferries, of course, Crossing Brooklyn Ferry. And we get to hear from Howard Nelson, who is an illustrious poet, a favorite here at the Whitman Initiative. And he's also written quite a bit about Whitman. I know he's got a collection out called, I think, Earth My Likeness, Nature Poetry of Walt Whitman. That's really worth a good look. And he's a familiar name to me from the Walt Whitman Encyclopedia, where he wrote a few very important entries. So Howard Nelson, Stephen Killen, and me next month, on April 13th. But for now, I'm thrilled to be joined by a good friend and a fellow Whitmaniac, Jason Koo. Jason, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Karen. This is great. I'm excited to do this. I like all things Whitman, so yeah, you pretty much just have to ask.
Well, and where our relationship goes back quite a way. And of course, I had to honor you today by wearing my own Brooklyn Poets shirt. And you know what team I'm on, of course, right? Do I have to? I guess I have to do this really well.
It's funny how your body is like flashing in and out of materiality.
Walt would love that.
That seems apt. Yeah.
Jason is the creator of Brooklyn Poets, and he's going to be talking about that organization with us today. Brooklyn Poets has an amazing website with a lot of great swag, especially if you were a fan of Whitman. I have like 5 t-shirts from you guys, but let me back up and just say a few words about Jason, who is just one of these people in New York that you feel like shapes the city. I'm so happy to have you here. We've got this stuff on the website, but I might as well go through it. He's been named one of the 100 most influential people in Brooklyn culture by Brooklyn Magazine. He's got 3 gorgeous full-length collections of poetry. I've got the More Than Mere Light right here, which is, oh, actually, no, I don't. Sorry. I have The Man on Extremely Small Island. I don't know, that goes in and out of things, which I just adore. America's Favorite Poem. Woo! You can't really see these too well with my background. And you know what else I really like, Jason? The anthology that you guys did. I know this is not just your work, but for Whitman's 200th birthday, this is just like a gorgeous collection of Brooklyn poets and Whitmanically inspired. But your own work, I guess the three full-length collections are More Than Mere Light, America's Favorite Poem, and Man on Extremely Small Island, which won the Novo Poetry Prize and the Asian American Writers Workshop Members' Choice Award for the Best Asian American Book of 2009. He's also the author of the chapbook Sunset Park and co-editor of the Brooklyn Poets Anthology, which is a must-have on any New Yorker shelf. Check it out if you have not seen it. He has published his poetry and prose in the American Scholar, the Missouri Review, Village Voice, and Yale Review, among other places, and won fellowships for his work from the NEA, National Endowment for the Arts, Vermont Studio Center, and New York State Writers Institute. And right now he is teaching at Quinnipiac University, where he's working really hard. I know you got those midterms. I'm doing it myself now. I can't believe you're here. Jason, welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it is I have midterm grades due tomorrow at 9 a.m. It's always nice when you get the 9 a.m. deadline. That's
oh my gosh.
Yeah, so it's not really due tomorrow. It's kind of due today. Yeah. Anyone that does admin knows that a 9 a.m. deadline is terrible. You should always make it 5 p.m. at least.
What are you teaching at Quinnipiac this semester?
Oh, man. I'm teaching Intro to Writing Poetry, which is great. I always teach
that's
that.
Great.
Advanced Poetry Writing Workshop. And then I have 2 sections of first year writing. One, it's called 102. This section of it focuses on the research essay. But yeah, it's been a fun year at Quinnipiac.
Do your students have no idea how lucky they are to get you for writing? Are any of them?
I'm pretty sure that's true. I think they have absolutely no idea. We've been teaching, I mean, some of us anyway have been teaching in person all year. They've been doing this hybrid approach, and it's really been straight up brutal. I don't recommend it. Teaching in a mask, it's not something that works at all pedagogically. Teaching in a mask to students who are wearing masks, and also teaching students on Zoom at the same time. I don't know who thought of that idea, and it's terrible. So this is how we're starting the conversation.
No, that's okay. I didn't realize that you were you're teaching in person. I had no idea.
Yeah. We're also teaching an additional course that we don't normally teach for the same salary. It's been wonderful this year. Really, I can't say enough good things about the institution I work for. But luckily, I run my own organization where we don't abuse teachers. So when I teach for Brooklyn Poets, it's great. I just finished a blank verse workshop for Brooklyn Poets that I've been teaching for, I think, 6 years straight now, and it's always a joy, and it's reminds me all the time, every time I teach for Brooklyn Poets, why I started it, because it's the polar opposite to what happens sometimes in academia. Sometimes academia is great, as you know, Karen, but many times it's abusive and not great.
Yeah, and
I didn't mean to start us off on that.
Oh no! I actually
you asked.
We want this to be spontaneous. We don't want this to be academic, actually. Right. So we are stepping outside of that. And maybe we should start with Brooklyn Poets, actually, because it is so integral, right? It's your spiritual go-to, obviously, and I think for a lot of us this year, I mean, I've been teaching remotely, but still as a people person and as a person who believes in the spirit of place, which you do too, right? We're both very much Brooklyn based. I mean, it's just like,
although I live in Beacon now. I don't know if you
I saw that. How did you do that?
Yeah, I absconded. I left in August. Although Beacon, honestly, I don't know if you've been here lately, it really, I mean, I know they kind of say that about almost every new hip town in the Hudson Valley. It's like the Brooklyn of the Hudson Valley. But Beacon really is like the Brooklyn of the Hudson Valley. Main Street, I feel like is just a much better version of like Bedford, which is terrible in Williamsburg, but it's just a super long street that's great. I mean, so I live kind of like in the woods, which is great. So I'm a little bit isolated, and deer come to our property pretty much every day. But I can go to town in like 5 minutes, and the town is great. I don't really feel like I miss anything. in terms of like restaurants and bars and that kind of stuff. Obviously, there's parts of Brooklyn you can't replace anywhere, but yeah.
Well,
Anyway,
it's
just
a
wanted
really,
to make sure you knew that.
I
Was not
saw that you like prominently put that in your bio that you're now living in Beacon, and I thought, oh,
yeah,
that's
I
pretty
felt like
deep.
everyone needed to know.
Um, so and that's I mean, maybe, like we can ease into all of this, but you're not from the city originally anyway, right? Like you didn't
Well,
grow
yes
up.
and no. Because I was born in New York City. I don't know if you knew that. I was
I do
born in New
not.
York, not in Brooklyn. I was born in Beth Israel Hospital in Manhattan. That's when my parents were living in the Bronx. They lived here from about 1976. That's going to tell everyone how old I am.
Be careful.
From 1976 to 1979. Not very long. In fact, I don't really have any conscious memories of New York, although maybe some of the memories that I have from early on do trace from New York. I'm not sure. But yeah, I don't really remember my time here. After that, we moved to Toledo, Ohio, and then I grew up in Northern Ohio. First, we lived in Toledo, and then we moved to different suburbs of Cleveland. I think in 1986 is when we moved. Might have been the end of 85. Anyway, yeah, I mean, I feel like I have, I sort of had maybe the DNA of the city in me. Although I don't think of myself as a New Yorker, really. I always think I identify with Northeastern Ohio because that's where I grew up, and following the sports teams there in Cleveland really becomes a strong identification. But I moved back. I lived in New York a few different times. So after college, I lived in Astoria for a year. This is right before I started my MFA.
That sounds like a post-college move right there.
Yeah. So from 98 to 90, if I had been cooler, I probably would have lived in Brooklyn. Although at the time in the late 90s, Brooklyn was still pretty edgy. So
I mean, Astoria has its real charm. I remember because I grew up in Queens, and my parents used to take me to Bohemian Hall, which was a Czech bar when I was growing up. I mean, I think it's developed into kind of a more hip place to go, but Astoria.
I liked Astoria.
Yeah,
I mean, I don't think I would have called it hip back then. Not that I really cared or even knew what that meant in 1998. But yeah, I enjoyed my time there. Although I honestly I think I spent most of my time in Manhattan because I was big in like museums back then and just experiencing the city because I had never really done that as an adult. So like I had this sense that I was born there and I felt like I kind of had to rediscover it. Or really not even rediscovered, like pretty much discover it for the first time. And then I was in grad school for thousands of years. And then I moved.
Wait, what did you get? You went undergrad to Yale, right?
Yes. So after Yale, I moved to Astoria. And then I did an MFA at the University of Houston, and then a PhD at the University of Missouri, Columbia. And then I taught for a couple of years at Davidson College when Steph Curry was there. If you all know who Steph Curry is, you should. And then I didn't know at the time that he would become one of my mortal enemies because my Cleveland Cavaliers would face his Golden State Warriors 4 times in 4 years. But after North Carolina, I moved to Brooklyn in 2009. And then I lived there for 11 years before moving to Beacon in August of last year. Yeah. So after moving to Brooklyn in 2009, I started Brooklyn Poets in 2012.
Okay, so we've got moves back and forth, crisscrossing across the country. I understand better now how you moved to Beacon so comfortably, right? Because the city is a place that you love, but you've lived outside of the city. There's life outside of the city too.
Yeah.
So you can be connected with Brooklyn even if you're not there. But we're getting some questions in the chat actually about your first experience of Whitman, and I guess maybe I want to back up even further. How about poetry? Like, where does poetry come in to Northeast Ohio? And that I don't associate. You said sports teams. That's just about like where I'm at with Toledo, Ohio. So where does the poetry come in?
Well, so first I lived in Toledo, and then we moved to Cleveland. That's where I really started following sports. I didn't really get into poetry until late in high school. And I would say my first real sort of conversion experience wasn't like poetry proper, but Shakespeare's plays. So it was Hamlet, which is obviously poetry, just dramatic poetry. Hamlet was the text that really, I think, converted me to literature. And when I think of literature, I mean like, I guess, a serious engagement with literature. It's not like that I hadn't been reading before. I had, but mostly for school. And I'd always been of that sort of lazy high school student's opinion that like the writer doesn't really mean anything that we're talking about when we discuss this stuff in English classes. I always had that very cynical attitude, like, well, did they really mean to say all these things? I don't think so. I think we're just making all this up. And then reading Hamlet, I mean, I can honestly say it changed my life, because that was the first time I really felt as if the text was smarter than me. And the text seemed to be talking to itself. Like it seemed to be highly aware of what it was doing. And I was noticing this in a way that was honestly freaking me out. So like, I really kind of went down this amazing rabbit hole with that text, where it seemed like every line was, meaning several different things at once. And you could see this kind of referentiality back and forth across the play. And, so when we would have these discussions about the play within the play and how the play has this kind of meta theatricality, that was stuff that was just mind blowing to me. Like I feel like I read it at the exact right time, and I had a great teacher. This was in, I think, AP English. This would have been my senior year. This teacher named Nancy Lerner, who was just an amazing teacher.
This was in high school.
This was in high school, yeah.
I think that is so awesome, because here I was racking my brain about Yale, Harold Bloom, who's taking you through Shakespeare.
Well, then studying with Bloom in college was really cool. But yeah, I'd had the conversion experience already, which made me, I guess, prepared for the likes of Bloom. But yeah, that got me into the idea of writing as a vehicle for making meaning, which is not something that had occurred to me before. Like I had written stories before that, even some poems, but I didn't take them seriously as ways to like make meaning in the world about human experience. After that, I sort of saw that possibility, but I didn't really start writing poems and getting into sort of poetry proper, meaning like lyric poems or contemporary poems, until my freshman year of college. So that year I took.
It's still early, Jason. I would say that's still like. Did you have a role model like in your family or friends? Was there a writer that?
Yeah, not my family. I guess I would say it seems early to me now. Now that I'm much older, like I'm more than twice as old.
Well, think about it. If you're a freshman, would be like, oh, I'm interested in a life.
Yeah, you're right. Like, but I mean, I feel like I didn't have any real experience or exposure to poetry, not really in any significant way. So when I got into poetry, I felt like this classic sort of Bloomian experience. I felt very belated. Like I felt very late to the game. Perfect. It just seemed like all of my peers and everyone in my classes, like they had just had this kind of bedrock of reading that they were drawing upon, either from schooling or just from having their parents or other role models, as you say, like expose them to stuff. Like no one in my family was reading poetry growing up, or let alone even like talking about it. Even my teachers in high school, aside from like, it's not that they weren't teaching poetry. It's just that they weren't talking about it in like a creative writer kind of way, like it's something that you might do with your life.
Funny. I get it, because I had the same experience. My parents knew nothing about literature or poetry, and I had some good teachers, but I didn't have anyone that really comes to mind that was a role model. And I think sometimes when that happens, you also go whole hog into something, right?
Maybe, yeah.
Like I think that has something to do with the force and that I feel, behind the passion that I have for literature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I believe that. I often talk about that either with my students or sometimes when I do interviews about sort of understanding, I guess, because sometimes people ask like, well, how did you know you wanted to become a poet or something, some kind of related question?
That's a great question to ask you right now.
Yeah, in fact, I can talk about it right now. So I identify with what you were just saying, because I think when you haven't had something put in front of you, and you haven't had like role models or teachers telling you like, oh, you know, you should do this or you could do this, when no one's been telling you that, and then you discover something like poetry that really seizes you and just kind of blows everything apart in this way that is absolutely, you know, magnetizing and like whole, like soul involving, it
Right.
really feels like it's yours. Like you feel a conviction about it that is, because like you feel like you chose it or it chose you. So it really feels like this thing was calling you, rather than you sort of wondering or you know, speculating whether you got into something because someone else kind of pushed you into it. You know, like if I had become a doctor or lawyer, I know I'd probably have decades of regret at this point, thinking like, did my mom push me into that? Is that why I became that thing?
Right.
Whereas so when I would talk to my mom about this stuff, because obviously she did not want me to go into poetry, I would try to explain it to her this way. You know, I just feel like I would always regret it if I never pursued this, because I feel the seriousness about it and this understanding of poetry in this intuitive sense that I never had with, you know, the sciences or law, certainly. So I just told her, you know, like I feel this conviction about it that I would never regret choosing this, you know, and if it ever comes to a point where I feel like I can't do it, I'm certainly not going to regret it. Whereas if I go into law or medicine and I feel like it's not working, I know I will regret not pursuing poetry. So I can totally understand what you mean by feeling like the passion in a lot of ways is probably stronger when it hasn't been something that was put in front of you. So Whitman was someone that I, you know, read in high school, but didn't really affect me that much. And then,
But what did you read? Like, because I find
well,
like,
you know, we read selections from like Song of Myself, but to speak to what we were just talking about, like, you know, it was something that was taught in like the American literature
right.
portion of our, I think it was probably my junior year, or maybe my sophomore year. I can't remember which year.
You know, you're actually
But
lucky to have been exposed to him, because a lot of people, because
yeah, now they don't even read him,
right, a typical question that I
which
get,
is
that I
sad.
ask people on the show, and like for the most part, I don't even remember. And I was at that point, I was in high school in Long Island, and even like next door to Walt Whitman's birthplace, I was
Yeah.
not reading any Whitman. And I think today, somehow, even though he's accepted as a national voice, right, like the bard of democracy, he
Right.
also is, I think, still sort of, people are suspect of his sexuality, you know, the gender issues, the identity. There's still sort of a closure to Whitman because he is not
I,
as sort of
I
safe.
wish I
Yeah.
felt if it was even that sophisticated.
Oh,
The
okay.
resistance to him. I honestly think the resistance is just like, wow, these are really long poems. How do I enter these? You know, and I feel like he's become this kind of monument that people just sort of accept, but they don't ever actually sit down with. But to finish what I was um, talking about, I feel like you have to be, I mean, this is true for any writer, but maybe even especially true for someone like Whitman, that maybe seems more difficult at first because of the size of the poems. I feel like you have to be ready to receive it, right? So, you know, you can get exposed to it in high school. Maybe that helps break down your defenses a little bit. But I read him again on my own my freshman year of college. And you asked me about role models. I feel like the first real role model I had in terms of someone that got me like got me to start really reading on my own was not actually a teacher, but was a friend of mine my freshman year who lived down the hall, who was an upperclassman. So he was a junior when I was a freshman. And I remember walking into his dorm room the first time and just seeing like the number of books he had. I had never met another young person like that. Like, I mean, that was basically, you know, my generation. You know, he's like a couple years older than me. Like, he had this small room, and then he had this set of shelves, and it wasn't packed with like Stephen King novels or something like I was reading. He had like the Western canon there, and you know, it was like a very sort of like white Western canon that he read. But you know, to someone that was like 18 and had never been exposed to that, that was pretty mind blowing. And he would talk about writers like Whitman. And at the time I'd be like, yeah, I love Whitman. And I just acted like I had read him, even though I hadn't really read him. And then I was, you know, studying poetry in my classes. We were reading like the major English poets from like Chaucer to Spenser and Milton and so on. So we didn't read Whitman in that class. So I decided to start reading these poets that my friend Tom would mention just in conversation. And so that's when I went back to Whitman, and then I was able to really receive it. And I was like, what is this? And I think maybe because I had the context of reading these very old English poets who wrote in meter and like in very strict form, Whitman was incredibly liberating. And it just seemed like there was something that was just like earth shaking being exposed to him at that particular time. So that was really when my love affair with Whitman began. And, you know, since then I've gone back and reread him multiple times.
Well, he's been really important even to Brooklyn poets, right? He's like your symbol. I really, if you guys hadn't done it, we would be doing it at the Whitman Initiative. But the little picture of the basically the
1855.
Yeah, the image behind me here with since 1855, which is just perfect.
Right.
So
that was our little joke.
So, I mean, was Whitman kind of a shaping influence behind the idea of Brooklyn poets? And I guess, like, why Brooklyn? Especially after you telling me that you really didn't live that much in Brooklyn.
Yeah. It's funny that because you sent me that question, why Brooklyn, ahead of time. And that, I don't know if you know this, that's the last question we ask in our Poet of the Week feature. So I was like, wow, now I have to answer this question. I've never had to answer this question before. Yeah, I wouldn't say Whitman wasn't the first like thought that came to mind for Brooklyn poets. So it's not as if Whitman inspired the idea of Brooklyn poets. So like first I arrived at the idea, like it was very kind of practically motivated at first. I may have even talked to you about this before in some other conversations we've had, but I thought I was going to be out of a job at the time. I was teaching at Lehman College in the CUNY system, and I had like a full-time temporary thing that was ending, and I didn't get a job offer from the interviews that I had at the MLA conference. So I wasn't sure what I was going to do. So I was like trying to line up adjunct work, which seemed, you know, really depressing because that's what I had been doing before I got this 2-year thing at Lehman. So while I was teaching at Lehman in this full-time thing, what I was doing, I was directing the graduate program, and I had this insane course load. It was like a 4-4 course load while also directing the graduate program. So while I was doing that, I would think to myself in this kind of utopian, idealistic way, you know, why is it that I can't just teach my own workshops? Because I had really kind of gotten like just fed up with the system of academia. Like it just like the semester system didn't make sense. Like I always noticed the sag halfway through the semester, maybe even a little bit before, just seemed like this 14 to 15 week model didn't really make sense. So I started thinking in terms of these like 5 or 6 week models. Like what if we just focused on these little bursts and we just focused on like a kind of form, or we focused on a theme or something like that. And what if we actually could have really small classes, because it's really hard to teach writing when you have like 20 or more students. So I would envision like 8 to 10 students. And I was like, why do I have to, you know, take the subway to work? Why don't the students just come to my apartment and it'll just be like a dinner party? So I started looking at models for that exist. And so the great thing about Brooklyn is that Brooklyn, maybe more than any other place, really, especially at that time, maybe it's a little bit different today, but I think it's still true. I feel like it's just a sort of breeding ground for like DEY kinds of instructional experiences, right? So at the time, like Brooklyn Brainery, I think had just started, which has this kind of model where they hire different people to teach courses on pretty much anything. And Sackett Street Writers Workshop had recently started before this. So like when I just kind of Googled around, I found these other models for people that were just teaching, either like I think Julia Fiera, who founded Sackett Street, just like started the first workshop in her kitchen. And I was really inspired by that story. And it was just like this small group workshop. I think she put out an ad on Craigslist. So I started.
It's the dream, I must say. It's like, I'm sure people, because we've got questions in the chat, people are very active in the chat right now, but just so that you know, like that, I guess most of us listening are just like, you did it. You realized the dream. It's just like create your own university. I hope, Jesse, you're listening, because Jesse and I have been dreaming about this for a long time. So, I mean, how did so you put an ad in Craigslist and people?
No. Well, actually, I think I did in the beginning. I'm laughing because like the dream was hard to achieve. And I feel like there was maybe some luck involved, but I think also just, I want to say like maybe just the spirit of Brooklyn helped out, and maybe just like the you might even say like the imprimatur of like Whitman's image helped out.
Mm.
So I think a big part of it was the name Brooklyn Poets. I feel like when I arrived at that, everything kind of locked into place, and I feel like almost like a beautiful poem would unfold. I feel like the whole idea for it took shape, and I feel like it was something that people could respond to. So I had this workshop model at first. I wasn't thinking of it as a nonprofit. I just thought of it something like I would teach these workshops on my own.
Right.
Then luckily I got the job that I currently have at Quinnipiac. It was like a very late job ad that came out, I think like after MLA, I think sometime in February or March, the ad was posted. But by then I had already put in like, I don't know how, like I would say like hundreds of hours of work, like I designed this whole curriculum of classes, and I just put a lot of thought into this.
Yeah.
So I thought, and at that point, like I had come up with the name. And the name sounded like something. So I was thinking like, what am I going to call this? Brooklyn Poetry Society, which is I think sometimes what people think it's called, or Brooklyn Poetry Workshop, and those didn't really sound like anything. And then here's where sports is important for all you people that think sports has no connection to poetry or literature. I think because I had a love of sports, I thought of the name Brooklyn Poets. I was like, well, what if it was just called like Brooklyn Poets or something? And then it sounded like something, like it sounded like a team.
Oh my
And
God.
you know, when I would think
I can't believe that's the basis of it.
Yeah. Well, when I would think of Brooklyn literary history, like I would, you know, it's not just Whitman, you know, and at the time I was living in Brooklyn Heights, which is, you know, you're conscious of that literary history every time you walk out the door. And I was reading a lot of books about the literary history, specifically of Brooklyn Heights, but also like reading like the Broken Land Anthology and other books about Brooklyn and Brooklyn history. And I was thinking like, that's what this is. Like, it really is like a team of poets. It's a very big team of poets, and obviously other writers as well. So it's just like, I had this, what I thought was like the sound of something. And when I looked for the URL, somebody had bought the brooklynpoets.com URL. I don't know who bought it. They still haven't used it for anything. So, but brooklynpoets.org was available. So I feel like that was fate that sort of pushed this in the direction of a nonprofit, because I think that, coupled with the idea that Brooklyn Poets sounded like obviously more than just one person,
Right.
like it started sounding like a community organization. And at the time I was already doing this reading series at this art studio called Studio 10 in Bushwick, which still exists, that was started by my ex-girlfriend's father. So I was already doing a reading series. So I thought like, oh, you know, I could fold that into this, and we could have workshops, we could have a reading series. And then I kind of just started rolling from there. And then I thought of the t-shirts pretty quickly after that, because again, like if you're into sports, this is why sports is important, right? People. Like I could immediately imagine basically this image, which is like sort of like our take on the Brooklyn Dodgers image with like poets here underneath. And like that image came to me very quickly with like, you know, like poets' names on the back. And I imagined that was something that could sell and could make money and raise money for the org. And that fall, I founded Whitman's birthday, May 31st, 2012. And that fall at the Brooklyn Book Festival, that was the first time we sold these t-shirts. And I didn't know how it was going to go, but there were these moments. I think there was one moment when like my girlfriend at the time started looking at me, like one of our early board members turned and looked at me, like everyone kind of just turned and looked, because we had this like crowd of people at the booth.
Oh, that's so nice.
It was clear like we had something. Like they kind of just looked at me like, this is going to be something, just because we had this crowd of people buying our, I mean, like we didn't do anything yet. I taught like 2 workshops. We had a couple readings and we had these t-shirts, but it seemed like it was going to be something. So like, it kind of all just grew from there.
I have to say, and I'm not being paid to do this, that the t-shirts are amazing. And it's what people want on a t-shirt. You're right. Like, this is such a great case of branding. Like, you know, like you pick the right name for this organization, and you're not when there's a lot of Whitman themed shirts. That's why I buy them all the time for friends and family. But you're not actually teaching poetry like that. You're just workshopping current poets, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we are. It's just that it's built in. So you're not going to. Well, have we? There was a time where we started offering what we called guided reading classes, where some teachers would teach courses just like reading poets. And I think Bill Zavatsky did one on Whitman and Dickinson. It's just that the reading classes were not nearly as popular as our writing workshops, which maybe tells you something about consumer America's interest in writing original poems versus reading poets by other people. So
that's also okay and
yeah,
wonderful.
but like people are reading poems all the time in the
Right.
workshops. So like, it's just, that's not how we sell them. Like we sell them as writing workshops. And then we've started recently this Craft Lab seminar series that Jay Deshpande just did the first one on Sunday, which involves more like lecture about, the craft of poetry and literature.
Oh, cool.
So I'm imagining we'll probably have something related to Whitman soon.
So how can people get involved? Like if somebody's listening and they've never looked at the website, like what would be the way you suggest if they wanted to try it out?
Well, I guess starting with the website is the first thing. Yeah. So I would go to brooklynpoets.org. Again, it's grown very expansively from those early days. And now we have many different programs that we offer. We have a to use the adjective to describe this series, we have a very robust workshop program. That's like really our central program. So in the beginning, it was just me teaching workshops. Now we have, I think by now we've more than 50 teachers have taught for Brooklyn Poets since 2012. We offer workshops in 3 different seasons, one winter, spring. Right now, all of the workshops for this season have sold out, which is amazing. Even online, arguably the workshops are doing better now because they are open to everyone online. And then we also offer them in the summer and the fall. Again, we have that reading series. We have a monthly workshop that we call the YOP, which is part generative writing workshop and part open mic. We have this new series called the Staff Picks, which has a reading coming up on April 1st, which is curated by my staff. So I don't have any part in that curation. I wanted to have something that they could do just on their own. And that series focuses specifically on poets that don't yet have books published. So I feel like often those are the poets that are kind of missed. Usually when you have a reading series, it's to help to people promote their books and drive their book sales. So yeah, there's a lot of different things going on. I would check out brooklynpoets.org. You can follow us on social media and get our announcements through those channels, or you can subscribe to our newsletter, which you can do on the homepage for our website. So
wow, it sounds like you're keeping your day job, even though this sounds like it's grown so big. Like you're really, and I just know managing this organization that, they develop such like tentacles.
Yeah.
Like it's really, have you ever thought about just like giving up everything and just going whole hog into Brooklyn?
It may get to that point. We'll see. So far I've been able to manage it. I'm sort of preternaturally organized. And I've probably gotten 5 times as well organized because of having to do Brooklyn Poets in my quote unquote spare time. Yeah, I think, having a full-time job helps with this because you do have a lot of time off as a teacher, as a professor in college. So that helps. And even when I'm teaching classes, I don't teach every day. So I have off days that I can commit more time to Brooklyn Poets. But yeah, like as we're growing, it's sort of I can sort of imagine a point where I might feel like because like our hopes are soon over the next couple of years are to open our own building, either, find a way to own our own building, which we're working towards, or possibly rent. We're sort of having this debate internally now among our board directors. But I think once that day comes, and it seems like I have to be present for the day-to-day operations of our venue, I may have to step away from my job. But it's hard to give up the benefits of a full-time professorial job. Despite the abuse that goes on, that's pretty much the only reason why I put up with it, because I have students elsewhere that I think probably appreciate me more than my undergrads. Not that
they're
some
probably
of them
listening. And speaking
I'm positive that none of my undergrads are listening right now, but I know for a fact that some of my Brooklyn Poet students are. So that tells you the difference.
Yeah,
right
I think
there.
in the chat, actually, I see that.
So should we answer some of these? I don't know if we answered.
We should, but first, because the whole thing is about kind of you and your poetry. I feel like we've got to at least read a couple of your poems.
Right. Yeah, I almost forgot.
Bring you that you're the subject of this. Right. And I know Brooklyn Poets is very important, but I did want to get to you and maybe ask you to read a poem that you feel very strongly about that you've written, or if you've got
Yeah.
some work in progress that you want to throw our way, we'd love to hear it.
Well, I'll read. I mean, I don't think we have time to read all the ones that I said to you beforehand that I might read, but I think I could read Struck from the Float Forever Held in Solution, since obviously that is Whitman inspired. And
Line from Crossing Brooklyn Ferry.
Yeah, it's the most arresting line, I think, from that poem. It's always the line I focus on in discussions of the poem with my undergrads that generally go terribly. But when we can zero in on this line, it can get fun, because I think some of the students at least have the experience of like, whoa, like there's a lot more going on here than I thought was happening. But this poem also, I think, will give some sense of, my time living in Brooklyn Heights. It doesn't talk about founding Brooklyn Poets, but it's meditating on Brooklyn literary history and my own place in it, or trying to figure out what my place in it is, specifically as a Korean American male, because, some of the, I think, interesting experiences I had living in Brooklyn Heights and really getting steeped in literary history, and going back to people like Whitman and Hart Crane, who is my favorite poet, who's obviously also deeply connected to Whitman because of Whitman's influence on his work. But, becoming conscious of my difference in terms of my racial and ethnic identity, and sort of imagining whether Whitman in Crossing Brooklyn Ferry was really imagining people like me, because it's obviously a poem of like, that's making this big inclusive gesture to all of us. But I couldn't help but wonder, like, does that vision actually include someone that looks like me? Mm-hmm. Because at the time, I don't know if there were any Koreans in America in 1855 to 1856. Maybe there's like
no, probably. I don't think Koreans, but definitely Chinese. I mean,
yeah, exactly.
About the Chinese,
but no one specifically like me. So
right.
That made it interesting. Struck from the Float Forever Held in Solution. Scuzz buckets, my thanks. You kicked me out of comfort and showed me how comfort was conniving to make me content with an almost life, the life I sort of wanted to have. And now I'm blasted out of sort of into the sun tonnage of the city. Look at the bridge accelerating against the sky, taunting the tourists with their tiny cameras on the puny pier. It dares me to think of it as a mere amenity, though this was the life, ever since I first read Hart Crane and saw him on the roof of 110 Columbia Heights, boasting the Brooklyn Bridge as his background. He came with nothing and left buildings. I came, even reduced by you, with much more, and walk around his old neighborhood like it's my inheritance. I walk past 110 Columbia Heights, where a Jehovah's Witnesses building now stands. I see through their watchtower to Crane's broken tower. Out of the rubble of his life, just one phrase's swift, unfractioned idiom annihilates their literature. I look down at the gleaming musculature of the East River and imagine Whitman curious in the crowd on Robert Fulton's ferry, imagining me. Did he imagine me, most particular me, the only son of Korean immigrant parents, crossing with the others on the ferry? I don't think I would have occurred to him, which is no offense, as even the Brooklyn Bridge did not occur to him. You could say Roebling and then Crane out-imagined Whitman, but he had the right, the original idea. And you can still feel his presence, my enemies, in the movement of these waters, the generosity of his imagination rippling to me, not banked by its limits, the kind of generosity you did not extend to me as you imagined my life going nowhere. I try to extend this generosity to you, shamed by Whitman into questioning my enjoyment of the view on this gentrified shore, the reward for what I've done. I could say I'm not as bad as you think, but it's true. I'm worse than you think. Whitman knew this, knew what it was to be evil, how we shouldn't be fooled by any soaring, generous spirit, least of all his, that there was always something evil in it, always something conquering in the creative. That bridge up there, Crane's connective tissue, grand gateway to the west, has evil in it. So many dark patches went into it. So many lives, quite literally, went into it. John Roebling killed by it, Washington Roebling crippled by it, confined during construction to the same room on Columbia Heights that Crane occupied as he climbed the bridge with his own construction and was killed by it. But his name is now an aria out of it. His dark life made it leap with more life. Just as Whitman's life made Fulton's Ferry more lasting than a commute, even after the Roebling's Bridge replaced it with this refurbished historic pier, where Whitman's words have washed up to decorate the railings. And now I'm enjoying the sculpted shade, reading East Goes West by Young Il Kang, the heroic father of Korean American literature who made his share of enemies when he left his family behind during the Japanese occupation of Korea, first to study Western science in Japan by passing himself off as Japanese, then to flee to New York looking for that same rebirth, that ever revivified life that Crane sought, but inexorably unfamiliar, rebuffed by realities Crane never had to deal with, scuffling through a missionary college for a year in Canada, reading David Copperfield out loud to his tutor to gain better command of English, enough to write the first novels in the language by a Korean in America. Kang surely imagined me. He would be proud, I think, to see me living as a poet in Brooklyn Heights, a part of his legacy, reading his book. I'm feeling all of them, Whitman, Kang, Crane, move through me, wondering how I got so lucky to live in a precinct of their imagination, then remembering that it was you, my enemies, who got me here. I had to be a little bad for that to happen. So much good has come of such bad that I can't help but worry, don't worry, whether I deserve it, whether I'm not the worst kind of American, whether I'll ever do enough to return what you gave me, whether I'll screw this up, whether I'll ever feel like I have enough, whether I am enough.
Wow. Jason, this is so gorgeous. I mean, it's got kind of a feeling, especially at the end. I catch that rhythm, that sort of welling up that Whitman has going on in Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, but you're showing, also what the ways in which you don't want to be like him, right? There's a real delicacy in this, and I like how you politicize this. I feel like this poem was way ahead of its time. When did you write this?
Thank you for saying that. This is my second book. I would say probably
it's like 2008, right?
No, the book came out in 2014, but I wrote it after I moved to Brooklyn Heights, which probably would have been, I can't remember exactly, but probably 2011 to 2012, because I moved to Brooklyn Heights in 2011, that summer. And I remember reading Young Il Kang in Brooklyn Bridge Park that summer, or it was either the summer or the fall. So maybe it was September when it was still warm out, which was when I started drafting it. But yeah, so it's a while ago. So like Sundance, like 10 years ago.
Well, considering just like the complications of a father figure like Walt Whitman, right? Like if we want to still use a term like that these days. But I feel like this is, sensitively brings up a topic that we're all really wrestling with right now.
Yeah, I mean, you say it, you said nicely it was like ahead of its time, but I would say more specifically, I feel like it was kind of like ahead of its time just in my own way of writing poetry, if that makes sense, or like in the kinds of poems that I was writing, because up until that point, I didn't think of myself as writing very political poetry, I think almost to a fault. And I think part of that was, something that all writers of color deal with, especially at that time. And now, like, I feel like contemporary poetry is so healthily accepting of what used to be frowned upon as like identity poetry or political poetry. I mean, I think like American poetry now is so beautifully and healthily political. It's almost like you can't write a poem anymore without having some kind of political investment. Otherwise, nobody takes it seriously, which is great, because it used to be the opposite. And it's, I think a lot of people have either forgotten that or don't know what that era of poetry was like. But that was the era of poetry I grew up in, and especially when I was in grad school. Like if you wrote a poem that had any kind of political involvement or engagement at all, especially if you're a person of color, people would immediately pigeonhole it as being like an ethnic poetry, or poetry that is about identity, which is not as serious as like universal white poetry. But the thing is, like, that was the poetry, a lot of that was the poetry I admired, or like poetry like Whitman that I thought of as being very universal, or like Hart Crane, or any of the romantic poets that I loved. So, reading Young Il Kang, reading East Coast West for the first time was just like a mind-blowing experience, because the writer he reminded me the most of was Hart Crane. Even though he's a novelist, Kang's use of language is incredibly lyrical. It almost reads like poetry. And it's kind of hard to explain that just sort of like sentence by sentence. But if you know Crane's work, and then you read, like, and I was someone that was absolutely steeped in Hart Crane's work, because I wrote my senior thesis on him and was constantly going back to Crane, even though I don't write like him at all. So when I went and read Kang, I just had all of these thoughts about, just the realization that I had never had like a Korean or a Korean American teacher. Like I never even had an Asian or Asian American teacher of literature, or certainly of writing. So, and this is something I'm much more conscious of now, 10 years later, like what kind of difference that made in my own education. Because like I had to find all of these writers and learn about them on my own. And it was hard to find these writers on, like, nobody at Yale talked ever about Young Il Kang, for fuck's sake. They hardly, I heard about like Maxine Hong Kingston. I think that was pretty much it while I was at Yale, and Yale was a great school. It's not I'm saying like I didn't learn things at Yale, but it was a very white, Western European and white male canon in America. So I didn't get that kind of exposure. I might have gotten it if I had gone to like a California school, obviously, or maybe just another school on the East Coast, but I didn't get it, right? So there was a lot of decolonizing of my own mind and imagination that I had to do, which is, not to say that like I disavowed the influence of Whitman. It's just that I had to recontextualize it and also sort of reconsider it alongside my own identity, or thinking about my own identity, and then like other influences that would come into play, like Kang. Yeah,
there's such a kind of a raw truth telling, not only to your poetry, because you're telling us basically that stuff that is in the poem really happened, right? So it's really you, right? But even just talking to you, Jason, I think. And I just based on the wonderful notes that you're getting in the chat, it says here, Bill Livingston said he loved your poem.
Right. Thank you.
Well, you just said thank you. So there's a little bit more sincerity and truth telling. Yeah. But you come across even on Zoom, and they say that's a really hard thing to project across Zoom, right? The feeling of sincerity. But you're really doing that. And this poem too is so heartfelt, so real, right? I read the comments about the Watchtower and Jehovah's Witnesses. Of course, that's a mark of times past. Right. Now that's turned into luxury, whatever it is. But still, it's all really there. But there's a palpable, and God, to me, that's very Whitman-like. Like a real connection, like a spiritual connection to place somehow. You actually got a question like that from our intern, Freddie, who asks, do you find yourself or your poetry influenced by the places that you end up? Good and question. I guess you do, because there you read a poem clearly influenced by Brooklyn Poets.
I could speak to that. In fact, I was thinking of talking about that just as you were talking, Karen. I would say, when I first started getting into poetry, I didn't think of myself as being what sometimes people call like a poet of place, or I didn't think of myself as particularly interested in writing poetry of place, because John Ashbery, maybe just because of the influence of people like Bloom at Yale, but John Ashbery was, aside from Hart Crane, Elizabeth Bishop was my favorite poet, and probably stylistically the one that I took the most after or most tried to imitate. as a young poet, and his poetry is certainly not a poetry of place. It's almost like the anti-poetry of place. So I always thought that like to write a serious poetry, or like the poems that I wanted to write, would not be rooted in place like that. So I kind of took a very circuitous route to what I would think of as more place-based poetry, which I think also kind of goes hand in hand with like identity-based poetry, right? So like I didn't, again, like I had to take this kind of detour. Probably living in Missouri, I would say, I would sort of begrudgingly admit was an influence in this regard. And I say begrudgingly because Missouri is a very racist place and was not a place I enjoyed living. But I will say that it was probably a powerful influence on my poetry, because first of all, there was nothing to do there. So I just stayed in my apartment and worked on my poems. But I also, that was the first time I really felt my racial identity in a way that I had never felt before. Because I mean, I'd always lived in places that I think were either accepting of my identity or where I didn't feel like a lot of hostility about it, even in Northeastern Ohio, which is probably where I'd felt it the most. Whereas when I lived in Missouri, it was, there was like a powerful invisibility that I felt that was toxic. Anyway, I don't want to get so much into that, but I ended up writing a lot about the feeling of alienation and isolation, which is obviously what the theme of the first book was, called Man on an Extremely Small Island. And I still didn't think so much of myself as writing about place, but I kind of was. And that was a big impetus to me wanting to move back to New York. And at the time, I wasn't thinking specifically of Brooklyn. I was just thinking of New York City. But I started to become attracted to Brooklyn because my two best friends live there. And it's, obviously you would hear things about Brooklyn being great for writers, and I would hear about other poets that I liked that were there. And then I was also really into hip hop. So hip hop was experiencing this renaissance in Brooklyn at the time through people like Mos Def and Talib Kweli, obviously after Jay-Z and Biggie Smalls in the 90s. So I think I had this like hunger that was almost unlike any, like I'd never felt a real hunger to live any specific place before. I lived in Missouri and knew very clearly I not only wanted, but needed to live in a city as an adult. So at first I went to Davidson, North Carolina, which is not a city, but it was close to Charlotte. So that was good. That was kind of a city. And then I got this NEA fellowship, and I got the chance to move back to New York. And it was a big risk because I didn't have a full-time job lined up, but I was able to get some adjunct jobs. And then I just went for it. I was like, fuck it, like I have some grant money. I have a couple jobs lined up, and my two best friends live here, and my first book was going to come out soon. So I thought it was kind of like now or never. I was like, well, it seems like that would be a great place to be to help launch this first book, because I just knew there would be opportunities to do readings in New York that I would not have in North Carolina or anywhere else. Like you can just like walk into a reading in New York City. There's like hundreds of places that you can find to like read your work, it seemed like. So that became a big part of it. And Brooklyn really became like the place for me, like, which I think is true for a lot of young writers or artists trying to find their way. Like I never really felt a place where I felt like I had my like a true home for my identity as a poet. Not just as like the son of my parents being into Cleveland sports, So I felt like this was a place not only where I felt it already, but I could also make it my own home, or I could find my own people and build my own community, which literally started to happen when I founded Brooklyn Poets,
And you totally have given back to Brooklyn. I mean, we're so lucky to have you, even if you've deserted us for Beacon. It's fine. You
I still come back like pretty much every month.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, to me, you will always be a Brooklynite. And, we try to keep the show down to the hour limit. So we're already running over. I just wonder, could you read one more poem and then we'll call it a night? But
yeah, I would love to.
Yeah, that would be great. Just, whatever one you think would be a fun wrap up.
Well, I'm laughing because it seems appropriate to end with morning, motherfucker.
I don't even know the rules of Zoom. I guess
I'm hoping
anything, right?
your audience is okay.
I'm sure it's fine. Yeah. Well,
I mean, I don't think y'all are censoring your
No, we do not
your
bleep out
streams.
what you say. No, we do not.
But yeah, this is another poem about this. So this poem I wrote towards the end of my time in Brooklyn Heights, where I was informed by my landlord that she was selling the brownstone and I would have to exit soon. And this is after my ex and I had broken up. So I was kind of living there. I just had almost like the feeling like I was squatting in this apartment because like I couldn't afford the rent anymore, but my landlord hadn't sold the apartment yet. So she was kind of just allowing me to live there month to month. And it was a tenuous time. So that's where I started to feel like a separation from the sense of being at home in Brooklyn because of obviously because of the gentrification that was
housing,
ongoing.
right? Yeah, housing is everything when you live in New York. And I'm sure people heard that story of yours and they're all nodding their heads because yeah.
So I'm sure some of the people that are listening to this have heard this poem before, but because I've read it many times. But here it is again. Morning, motherfucker. Just pop the collar of my robe in this motherfucker, i.e. kitchen, as I make some sweet ass hash browns. Is that the start of a poem? It's barely the start of breakfast. Noon light comes streaming through the window. Is that the start of a poem? My landlady, what a word, just told me to be out of here by July 1st. At first I wrote, just told me to be out of her. Slightly different poem. The millionaire's buying her brownstone, milling past me as I cranked this up in my robe at this motherfucker, i.e. dining table, wondering if it could indeed be a poem. Demand it. I'm going to squat right here in this kitchen, i.e. motherfucker, with my $1 million syntax and hash browns and make those motherfuckers mill around me for life. I'll miss this motherfucking beautiful neighborhood of Whitman and Auden and Crane and Mailer and McCullers and Miller and Smith and Wolfe and motherfucker, how many more writers could live in these brownstones? How many more ampersands could live in contemporary poetry? Now there are probably no writers here except me. Oh, and little known former poet laureate of America, Phil Levine, rest in peace, on Willow Street, and fellow Asian American male poet Ken Chen, also on Willow Street. I wonder if they too pop the collars of their robes as they make some sweet ass hash browns. Mailer surely popped the collar of his robe. He probably put on boxing gloves to take his hash browns out of the oven. Hart Crane I can't see ever making, let alone eating, hash browns. Just too much cranium to contain in one kitchen. Whitman couldn't have eaten just one hash brown or two. He had to be making whole schools of hash browns, 40,000 hash browns forked with 40,000 motherforking forks. He would have written about all the potato fields they came from, sunsets over the cool brown earth that made their beds. Henry Miller likely would have fucked his hash browns. Auden would have had his hash browns at an appropriate time scheduled into the morning. Last night I talked about that motherfucker's face. What a motherfucking poet's face. Was Auden ever young? Did he come out of his mother's vagina already wrinkled? Imagine that vagina. Auden's face like a hash brown out of that vagina. I'm feeling better in spring in this motherfucking beautiful light. I'm dancing in this motherfucker, i.e. kitchen, as I flip these hash browns and think I can start to begin to forget you someday. I feel like if there is if there is a hell, I'm going to go to hell for those lines about Auden and the vagina.
You're going to Brooklyn, my friend. Jason Koo, Brooklyn poet. Man. We are so happy that was received so well by everybody that is watching this. And Jason, thank you so much for being here. It was truly
thank you for having me. This was so much fun.
So much fun to talk to you. It reminds me like how much I miss just hanging out with you.
Yeah, I know.
And talking like this on the street. Yeah. Everyone, thank you so much for tuning in tonight to hear Jason do his thing. And please check out the Brooklyn Poets Anthology. We didn't even get to talk about the bridge, the Poets Bridge.
That's fine. Yeah, poetsbridge.org. It's a network that I created for poets to find mentors. You can find that on the Brooklyn Poets that website too. I'll put that in the chat, brooklynpoets.org.
So all of these good things, and make sure that you get your swag on,
Yeah.
you know, like your
You
Walt
can find that through the website as well.
Brooklyn Poets shirt. All right, everyone. Have a good night.